The Occult Book, A Chronological Journey from Alchemy to Wicca by John Michael Greer, Part 2. C. 800 CE, Jabir ibn Hayyan. He was one of the greatest scholars of his age, the author of more than 100 books on a galaxy of subjects, but Jabir ibn Hayyan's great passion was alchemy. Born in Kufa, in what is now known Iraq, Jabir ibn Hayyan, 720 through 815, took up the study of medicine and for many years was a respected physician in his hometown. Later in life, the exact date is unknown, he was invited to Baghdad, the political capital of the Muslim world, by the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. By the time Jabir arrived in Baghdad, the great age of Muslim conquest was over. Although the pagan religions of Greek and Rome were strictly forbidden, the philosophical and scientific knowledge amassed by Greek and Roman scholars was not, and many branches of occultism were taken up by Arab scholars along with other relics of classical learning. Alchemy and astrology in particular attracted the attention of Muslim intellectuals. Once the surviving knowledge base had been mastered, a great deal of original work was done on both of those branches of occult study. Jabrir's arrival in Baghdad was part of that process. With the Caliph's financial backing, he set up the most complete alchemical laboratory of that time and carried out ambitious programs of experiments. His goal was not merely to make gold, but to understand the inner nature of metals and the natural world as a whole. He developed new methods for preparing a range of useful chemicals, devised ingenious furnaces to produce steady heat for the alchemy process, and proposed theories about the composition of metals that remained in place until the coming of the scientific revolution. 9th century, canon episcopi. Certain wicked women believe and profess that in the hours of the night they ride out on certain animals with Diana, the goddess of the pagans, and an innumerable multitude of other women, and in the silence of the dead night they journey out vast distances on the earth and obey her commands as their mistress, and is summoned to her service on certain nights. These words come from a decision made by the local church council in France during the 9th century. Later, the decision was mistakenly attributed to the Council of Ankara, one of the ecumenical councils that established the foundations of Christianity. In this form, it became part of Catholic canon law. The text began with the word bishops, episcopi, in Latin, and that later gave the decision its enduring name, the canon episcopi. The beliefs of the wicked women were not unique in the 9th century France. Across Europe, legends and church records tell of a body of shamanistic beliefs in which certain people left their bodies at night on certain dates to travel in the company of supernatural beings. To this day, no one knows for sure what lies behind those traditions. What gives the canon episcopi its importance in the history of occultism, though, it is that it is dismissed by the beliefs of the wicked women as superstition or at most hallucinations inspired by the devil, and declared it sinful to believe that witches had any power to harm Christians. Through most of the Middle Ages, as a result, Catholic religious authorities dismissed witchcraft beliefs, and only by the ignorant, and other occult traditions. Through most of the Middle Ages, as a result, Catholic religious authorities dismissed witchcraft beliefs and other occult traditions as foolish notions, held only by the ignorant. It was not until the 14th century that the canon episcopi was set aside and the burning times began. 1118, founding of the Knights of Templar. There were only 9 of them at first, knights from France who joined the First Crusade to seize the Holy Land from the Muslims. In 1118, they went before the Patriarch of Jerusalem and formed an order of warrior monks, combining the discipline of the cloister with that of the battlefield. They were assigned quarters on the site of the ruined Temple of Solomon and took the name, the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. History remembers them as the Knights Templar. Their official mission was to protect pilgrims against Muslim raiders on the dangerous trips from the ports on the Mediterranean coast. 9 knights constituted too small a force to guard the pilgrim routes, though, and for the first time 9 years, the Templars seem to have made no effect to increase their number. Long-standing rumors, backed by the archaeological evidence, suggest that much of their time was spent tunneling beneath the temple ruins. What they found there remains a mystery. In 1127, though, the Grand Master of the Little Order, Hugues des Payens, 1073-1136, returned to France. Thereafter, new recruits flocked to the Templar banner, and kings and nobles bestowed lavish gifts on the order. The poor knights quickly became one of the richest monastic orders in Christendom. Christian Templar properties across Europe funneled income to the Templar castles that guarded the Holy Land. The flow of funds was so great that the Knights Templar invented most of the principles of modern banking to handle them. Every time you sign a check, you're making use of a Templar's technique. In all of this, there was no hint of occultism. That would come later, after generations of Templar had lived in the religious and magical melting pot of the Holy Land, and would set in motion a legend and legacy that endured to this day. 1208, the Albigensian Crusade. They called themselves Cathars, from the Greek word for pure ones. Their enemies called them Albigensians, those people from Albi. After the French town where their early activities were centered, they taught a Gnostic Christianity in which God and Satan were equally matched, and human beings imprisoned in Satan's world of matter were called to escape to God's world of light. They rejected the authority of the Pope and the sacraments of the Catholic Church. Despite this, they established a foothold in northern Italy and southern France, beginning around the year 1000. From 1175 on, corruption among the Catholic clergy and effective preaching on the part of the Cathars led to dramatic growth on the movement. Rome responded by condemning Catholicism and heresy and sending missionaries to counter it. But those actions did little to slow the spread of the movement. In 1208, the rising spiral of tension broke into open violence when a papal legate was murdered in Carthage. In response, Pope Innocent III proclaimed a crusade. All previous crusades had been directed against the Muslims in the Holy Land. This was the first time the Church had called for the war against its enemies in Europe, but not the last. Fighting began in 1209 and raged until the last Cathar stronghold, Montségur, fell in 1244. In the course of the war, the south of France was devastated and hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians died. Among the legacies of the Albigensians, Crusade was a new organization which was founded by the Catholic Church in 1239 and tasked with hunting down heretics by any means necessary. Over the following centuries, that organization will leave a trail of blood across Europe, and thousands of occultists, among many others, would be condemned by it to a fiery death. Its name, of course, was the Inquisition. C. 1230. Origins of the Kabbalah. Everybody in the Jewish community of Narbonne in the south of France knew that Rabbi Isaac the Blind, 1160 through 1235, was a profound scholar who knew an enormous amount about the scriptures. Only among his inner circle of students, though, had rumors begun to spread that the respected rabbi was onto something far deeper and more exciting than the normal process of scriptural interpretation, a new way of understanding the Torah that seemed to open the door to astonishing mysteries. As the early history of the Cathar heresy showed, the southern provinces of France had a tolerant attitude toward dissidents. Jewish communities thrived there, and trade links with North Africa and the Levant brought knowledge that was lost in Europe's dark ages but had survived in the Muslim world. It was in that way that rabbis in southern France obtained two ancient books, the Sefer, the Book of Formation, and the Sefer HaBahir, Book of Splendor, that hinted at profound secrets hidden in the scriptures. The secret to Rabbi Isaac's new teaching, though, was numerical. The same traditions of number mysticism and sacred geometry that had entered the Western world with Pythagoras and played an important role in the Gnosticism, he and his students came to believe that these were the keys to the innermost teachings of Judaism and were so precious that they could be handed down only by word of mouth. Before long, the Hebrew word or tradition, which can be spelled Kabbalah or Kabbalah or Kabbalah in English, came to be applied to those teachings. After Rabbi Isaac's death, they spread rapidly through Jewish communities around the Mediterranean. Centuries would pass, though, before the Kabbalah became a core element of the wider occult traditions of the Western world. Translation of the Picatrice. Spain in the 9th century was a patchwork for warring kingdoms, but one of them, Castile, saw a remarkable flow of art, scholarship, and occultism under the patronage of King Alfonso X, 1221 through 1284, called El Sabio, the Wise. Many works on occultism were translated from Arabic. The most important was a strange book with an indecipherable title, Picatrice. The Arabic original was entitled Gayat al-Hakim, the goal of the sage. It was written in the 9th or 10th century by an anonymous Arab wizard in Spain or North Africa who hid his identity behind the name of the distinguished scholar and mystic Al-Mariti. Nobody knows why Alfonso translations changed the title or what the word Picatrice means. What made Picatrice so important was that it was an encyclopedic manual of magical philosophy and practice, the most comprehensive work on occultism to appear in the Western world between Iamblichus on the mysteries of Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. The teachings of Picatrice focused on astrology, but in astrology worlds away from the modern practice of reading personalities from a birth chart. Instead, the heavens were sources of magical power, and ceremonies performed when the planets were in certain positions drew down the powers of the stars to make marvels happen on Earth. To turn the pages of Picatrice today is to be transported into a world of talismans, potions, and perilous spirits that can help magicians, or, if a single detail of the ritual is omitted, destroy them. Once it was translated into Latin, Picatrice became the most notorious sorcerer manual in the Western world. Few dared to admit that they owned a copy, but most of the important magical handbooks of the time borrowed freely from it. Not until the widespread abandonment of occultism at the end of the Renaissance did it fall into obscurity. 1271, the fall of Haran. The town of Haran had endured for millennia despite the rise and fall of empires and civilizations. Its positions on the borderland between the Roman and Persian empires made it a refuge for pagans after the Roman Empire proscribed every religion but Christianity, and for many centuries it remained a haven not only for the pagan religions but also for the urgent occulted traditions Iamblichus had woven into the older pagan faiths. When the armies of Islam conquered the region in 639 CE, once again Haran endured. The Quran requires Muslims to tolerate three religions of the book: Judaism, Christianity, and Sabiha or Sabianism. What exactly Sabia is or was has perplexed Muslim scholars for many years, but the people of Haran managed to convince their Arab conquerors that Allah had them in mind and were allowed to keep their religious traditions unhindered. For more than 6 centuries thereafter, Haran thrived as a center of magical, astrological, alchemy, and philosophical studies, and many of its scholars rose to respected positions in the Islamic world. One of them, the famous astrologer Thabit ibn Qurra, 826 through 901, published a defense of the Haranian religion that was long famous. Wars between the Caliph of Baghdad and the Byzantine Empire devastated the region, though, and were followed by wars between contending Muslim rulers and finally by Mongol invasion. The temple of the moon god, the spiritual heart of Haran, was wrecked in the wars, and the trade routes in which Haran's prosperity depended did not survive the turmoil. In 1271, the city was abandoned by its last residents. Long before that happened, though, the occult traditions that had found a haven there had spread throughout the Muslim world and in due time reached Christian Europe as well. 1279, Abraham Abulafia goes to Serrano. From its origins in southern France, the Kabbalah spread rapidly throughout the Jewish diaspora. Abraham Abulafia, 1240 through 1291, was among his early masters. A rabbi's son from Saragossa in Spain, he studied the Torah and the Talmud with his father until the latter's death in 1258. Thereafter, in the usual fashion of the time, he traveled from place to place, looking for a teacher who could expound the deeper mysteries of the scriptures. He found what he was looking for in Barcelona in 1271, when a Kabbalist named Baruch Torgarmi introduced him to the Sefer Yetzirah and taught him to meditate on combination of Hebrew letters. Within a short time, Abulafia went under a profound spiritual awakening and came to believe that God had granted him prophetic powers. In 1279, a visionary experience convinced Abulafia that God had called him to convert Pope Nicholas III to Judaism. He then went to Rome, where he found that Pope had gone to the town of Serrano and sat after him. Rumors of his mission reached Serrano before he did, and the Pope ordered that Abulafia be seized and burned at the stake if he presented himself at the papal's court. Though he was told of this, Abulafia presented himself anyway and found on the arrival at the court that the Pope had died during the night. Church officials imprisoned Abulafia for a month and then let him go. He returned to Barcelona, but his idiosyncratic beliefs and claims of prophetic powers were too much for the local Jewish community. Eventually, he relocated to Sicily, then to a little island near Malta. Though he remained a controversial figure, he had no shortage of students, and his meditations on the Hebrew alphabet became a common practice later in Kabbalistic schools. 1307, Arrest of the Knights Templar. The orders went out secretly from the French royal court, carried by trusted messengers to the servants of King Philip IV. Throughout the Kingdom of France, royal officers gasped at the orders and sent for the men at arms. The pre-dawn hours on Friday, October 13th, echoed with the sounds of an armed men on the move. Then precisely at dawn, they struck, pounding on the doors of every chapter's house of the Knights Templar in France and arresting everyone inside. Some 2,000 members of the order, including 100 knights and the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, 1244 through 1314, were seized. The charge were heresy. In 1308, Pope Clement V authorized similar arrests throughout the Christian world. According to Philip IV's officers, the Templars had abandoned the Christian faith to worship an idol named Baphomet, who made plants grow. Scandalous rumors spread, and members of the Templar order were tortured until they confessed to every detail. Outside of France, investigations found no evidence of wrongdoing, but the French king would accept only one verdict. The order was dissolved by the Pope in 1312. Outside France, its members were quietly received into other monasteries, and in France, those who confessed to the charges could do the same thing. Those who contested the charges faced a grimmer fate. 54 of them were burned at the stake in 1310. 4 years later, Grand Master Jacques de Molay and one of his assistants suffered the same fate. Many historians have argued that Philip IV destroyed the Templars only to get hold of their immense wealth. Among occultists, though, the idea that the Templars had learned occult secrets in the Middle East had been common for centuries, and this belief inspired many later occult groups to take up the Templars' heritage. 1327, Cecchio de Ascoli burned at the stake. The cart, surrounded by a jeering crowd, hauled the condemned man to an open space where a tall wooden stake had been set up and firewood piled at its foot. Men at arms hauled the prisoner from the cart and bound him to the stake. Then, after a few words from the churchmen in attendance, a torch was plunged into the wood, and the condemned man's screams mingled with the roaring of the flames. In the medieval Europe, that was the punishment for heresy, but this was the first time this punishment had been meted out for the practice of magic. Cecchio de Ascoli, 1257 through 1327, became a professor of astronomy and astrology at the University of Bologna in 1322 and wrote a commentary on the De Safira of John of Sacrobosco, the astronomy's text used all over Europe at that time. His commentary was full of references to magic and included instruction on summoning a spirit named Floran into a magical statue. Cecchio soon found himself hauled in front of the Inquisition. Condemned as a heretic, he lost his professorship and was barred from teaching. Shortly afterward, he left Bologna and found a position as court astrologer to the Duke of Florence. Even so powerful a patron, however, could not protect him, and in 1327, he was condemned as a relapsed heretic and sent to the stake. Cecchio's terrible fate was a harbinger of much worse to come, for he was the first person to be condemned as a heretic for magical practices. Until his time, under the guidance of the canon episcopacy, the Catholic Church had dismissed the practice of magic as mere superstition, forbidden by church law but punishable only by a minor penance. Heresy, in contrast, was one of the worst crimes under canon law, and once magic was redefined as heresy, the door was open to violent persecutions of the following centuries. 1382, the Philosopher's Stone. From ancient times until the beginning of the modern era, there were those who claimed to have accomplished the great work of alchemy and created the Philosopher's Stone. Among them was Nicholas, 1330 through 1418, and Perinelli, 1320 through 1397, Flamel. Though they had a minor role in the first of J.K.'s Rowling's Harry Potter novels, the Flamels actually existed, and Nicholas Flamel's account of his travels and labors has been famous since his publications in the early 15th century. Flamel was a professional scribe who collected old books. One day he brought a curious manuscript, 21 pages long, that displayed alchemy emblems with no explanation. He and his wife, Perinelli, who was as interested in alchemy as he was, spent years trying to decipher them. Finally, with Perinelli's blessings, Nicholas went to Spain in the hope of finding an alchemist who could teach them what he needed to know. There he met an old Jewish alchemist named Conchis, who recognized the emblems and agreed to explain them. They set out on the return trip to Paris, but on the way, Conchis fell ill and died. He had taught Flamel enough, though, that after 3 years, Nicholas and Perinelli made the mysterious first matter, and the other steps followed soon thereafter. As the legend goes, on January 17, 1382, they succeeded in creating the white stone and turned half a pound of base metal into pure silver. On April 25th of that year, about 5 o'clock in the evening, they created the red stone and turned a half pound of base metal into pure gold. Historians agree that Nicholas and Perinelli's Flamel existed and became very rich in their later years. The source of their wealth has been subject of much speculation, but the Book of Diagrams, which was published along with Flamel's account, remains a core resource for contemporary alchemists. 1418, Origin of the Tarot. Plain tarot cards reached Europe from the Muslim world in the 14th century, but the first decks shown in the Western world were like modern playing cards with 4 numbered suits. It was in the first years of the 15th century that someone thought to add a set of symbolic cards to the pack and to create the first tarot deck. His name was Marziano da Tortona, the personal secretary of Filippo Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan, and an essay about the new cards that he wrote for the Duke in 1418 still survives. The additional cards in Marziano's new deck weren't the same as the standard tarot sequence. They were in ancient Greek deities, 16 of them, meant to represent virtues and vices. His invention, though, inspired others to make new decks with symbols of their own choosing. Since the sequence of emblems resembled nothing so much as the floats in the grand parades that were a common event in the Renaissance Italy, the name of those parades, triumphi or triumphs, after the triumphal procession of ancient Rome, came to be used for the symbolic cards. Tarot readers today still call them trumps. By 1450 or so, card players in Milan had settled on the 22 trumps used today, and cards painted around that year are recognizable forerunners of the modern tarot deck. Other Italian cities developed similar decks, but it was the Milanese deck that traveled with merchants to Marseilles in France, which would become the most important center of tarot manufacture. By the early 1800s, tarot had become a common card game all over France. Switzerland, and northern Italy, as common as poker in the United States today. Only in few places was it used for fortune telling, though, and it would take a pair of French occultists to transform it into the most important divination system of modern occultism. 1428, the Great Valahis witch trials began. The rumors had been spreading for months, perhaps years, in Valais, in the southern part of Switzerland. Witches were everywhere, people claimed, flying through the air, becoming invisible by means of sinister herbs, turning themselves into wolves to prey on cattle, casting curses on good Christians, and consorting with the devil. On August 7, 1428, peasants from 7 Valahis districts went to the authorities and demanded that something be done about it. The local political and religious officials were more than ready to take action and began rounding up suspects at once. Anyone who accused of witchcraft by at least 3 witnesses was arrested. Those who confessed were burned at the stakes. Those who refused to confess were tortured until they said what their accusers wanted to hear and then were burned. Clerk of the court Johannes Fraun, the author of the most detailed record of the Valahis witch trials, noted with amazement that some of the accused kept insisting on their innocence until they died under torture. Like most of the officials involved in the trials, he assumed that every person accused of witchcraft must be guilty. No count was kept of the number of accused witches who were burned or tortured to death in Valais after 1428, but historians have documented well over 300 victims. From Valais, the hunt for witches spread through most of Switzerland and from there into France and Germany. Even more significant was the Council of Basel, a church council that met from 1431 to 1437 in the Swiss city of Basel, and through the official sanction of the Catholic Church behind the witch panic. Over the years to come, as a direct result, around 500,000 people would die of horrible deaths. The burning times had arrived. 1464, translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. In the second half of the 15th century, the Italian state of Florence, had the liveliest intellectual scene in Europe. Its ruler, Cosimo de' Medici, set up a Florentine academy to rival the academies of ancient Greece and picked just the person to head it, the brilliant young scholar of Marsilio Finiso, 1433 through 1499. As the Academy's first project, Ficino had begun a complete Latin translation of the dialogues of Plato. Then, in 1463, a letter reached Cosimo from one of his agents in Greece. 10 years earlier, Constantinople had fallen to the Turks, and many cultural and literary treasures had been dumped on the market. Cosimo's agent had found one of those works, a copy of the Corpus Hermeticum. In 1463, nobody knew about the ancient habit of assigning authorship of texts to mythological sages, and so as far as Cosimo's agent or anyone else knew, the collection had been penned by the ancient Egyptian sage Hermes. Cosimo wrote back at once, authorizing the purchase, and told Ficino that Plato would have to wait. Something more important was on its way. Once the precious manuscript arrived, Ficino needed only a few months to translate it into Latin. Copies of the translation circulated widely, first in manuscript and then in printed form. Across Europe, people interested in the occult suddenly had access to soaring spiritual vision of ancient Hermeticism, a vision that gave occultism an honored place. For a century and a half, until the real date of the Corpus Hermeticum became known, the belief in its Egyptian root gave Hermeticism a prestige it would not otherwise have had, and turned into an immense cultural force across Renaissance Europe. 1486. The Malleus Maleficarum, Heinrich Kramer, 1430 through 1505, and Jacob Springer, 1435 through 1495, were Dominican friars, and like many members of their order in the 15th and 16th centuries, took an active role in the Inquisition. Their main job was catching and burning witches, and in the early 1480s they set out to write a manual for the benefit of their less experienced colleagues. The identification of magic with heresy that claimed Cecchio di Ascoli as its first victim had become widespread by the time Kramer and Springer set pen to paper. To the two inquisitors and to many other church officials, witchcraft was the ultimate heresy and terrifying threat to the Christian society that had to be stamped out with the utmost rigor. From the first great outbreak of witch hunting in the Vilayas, inquisitors had pierced together with what they thought was an accurate account of witchcraft. When someone was accused of witchcraft, the standard practice of inquisition in Germany and other parts of Europe was straightforward. The accused was read a list of questions. When did you sell your soul to the devil? How often did you attend the witch's Sabbath? Who else did you see there? And tortured until he or she gave the answers that the inquisitors expected. That procedure was enshrined in the pages of Kramer and Springer's book, The Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, which went on to become the most widely used witch hunter's handbook in early modern Europe. Guided by it or by any of its scores of other manuals that embrace the same lethal illogic, witch hunters across Europe tortured and killed tens of thousands of people. Before the burning times were over, the persecutions had affected every European country and leaped across the Atlantic to the American colonies, where the Salem witch trials of 1692 through 1693 were merely the most famous of a series of persecutions that were carried out to combat a threat that never existed. 1494, Johannes Reuchlins on the miraculous word. In the beginning, the Kabbalah had been the holy Jewish tradition, and it was not until the end of the 15th century that a Christian tradition of Kabbalah began to emerge. Johannes Reuchlin, 1455 through 1522, who set that process in motion, was one of the great scholars of Renaissance Germany. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and he studied the Kabbalah under several Jewish teachers. Convinced that the Kabbalah was as suitable for Christian mystics as it was for their Jewish equivalents, he wrote a treatise, De Verbo Mirifico, on the miraculous word, to prove the divinity of Jesus by using Kabbalistic methods. Its publication in 1494 inspired many other Christians to study the Kabbalah. The backlash was not long in coming. In 1509, a group of Catholic inquisitors petitioned Emperor Maximilian to order all Jewish books except the Old Testament burned. Maximilian consulted Reuchlin and on his advice rejected the petition. The inquisitors retaliated by accusing Reuchlin of heresy. Reuchlin's friend rallied to his support, and after 7 years of bitter controversy, Reuchlin's triumph, the Pope ordered all proceedings against him dismissed, and Reuchlin's friend unleashed one of the history's most influential satires, Epistolae Obscurum, letters from the very obscure men, which lampooned Reuchlin's enemies mercilessly and made them laughingstocks across Europe. While the controversy raged, Reuchlin wrote the first comprehensive treatise on Christian Kabbalah, on the Kabbalah art, which was published in 1517. Reuchlin's prestige as a scholar and the wide funny jabs the authors of letters from very obscure men leveled at his opponents helped keep attacks on Christian Kabbalists at bay. for close to a century. 1526, Paracelsus comes to Basel, a doctor's son from a remote Swiss village. 1493 through 1541, Paracelsus, for short, studied alchemy and mineralogy in the minor school in Villach, and then pursued a medical degree at Vienna for Ferrara before finding a series of jobs as a military surgeon in an assortment of European armies. His wanderings led him through Europe and beyond to Central Asia and Egypt. Wherever he went, he learned everything he could from local healers and folk magicians. His great skill as a healer won him an appointment as a professor of medicine in Basel in 1526, but he didn't keep the jobs long. He drank heavily and leavened his lectures by publicly burning the works of medical authorities, and got into endless quarrels with fellow professors, the officials of the university, and the city government. By 1528, he had to flee from the city by night and resume his wandering life. In the years that followed the debacle at Basel, Paracelsus wrote volumes of books on medicine, alchemy, and magic, expounding a complex system of occult philosophy. He argued that alchemy should focus on the creation of medicines rather than the transmutation of metals into gold and silver, and he was the first occultist to classify spirits into 4 elemental categories: sylphs of air, salamanders of fire, undines of water, and gnomes of earth. He drank himself to death in 1541, but his books outlived their author. For the next 2 centuries, until the eclipse of occultism by scientific revolution, his ideas and teachings were embraced by occultists across Europe, and the revival of alchemy in the 20th century drew extensively on his writings. 1533, Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. There were plenty of footloose scholars roaming across Europe in the Renaissance, and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, 1486 through 1535, was to all appearances just one more of them. Born into a noble but impoverished German family, he took a degree at the University of Cologne and then served in the military for a few years before beginning travels that took him from one end of Europe to another. Wherever he went, friends and patrons were waiting for him, and their interests, like his, focused on the forbidden art of ceremonial magic. In 1509 and 1510, he settled for a time at Sponheim, staying with his famous occultist Johannes Trithemius, 1462 through 1516, and it was there that he wrote the first draft of his book, 3 books of occult philosophy. As soon as it was finished, friends of Agrippa's began to circulate handwritten copies. Meanwhile, Agrippa resumed his wanderings, meeting influential occultists wherever he went. His network of connections was so vast that historians have wondered if he might have been the emissary of a secret society of Renaissance magicians that had members all over Europe. In 1528, he stopped for a while in Antwerp and there revised his massive manuscript for publication. The production challenges were considerable, and it did not help that an inquisitor, Conrad Colin of Ulm, declared the book heretical nearly as soon as typesetting began. Despite the difficulties, the 3 books of occult philosophy appeared in 1533. Other editions followed, as did translations into most European languages. For more than 3 centuries, it was hard to find anyone in Europe interested in occultism who didn't study Agrippa's monumental work. 1555, The Prophecies of Nostradamus. Born in a family of Jewish converts to Christianity, Michael de Nostradamus 1503 through 1566. Nostradamus was a Latinization of his family name, attended several universities before taking a degree in medicine at Montpellier. He settled in a French town of Agen and married a local girl, but plague struck the town and she died. He then resumed his wandering life. In 1547, he settled down again in the small town of Salon-la-Croix in Provence and met and married a wealthy widow, Anne Ponsard Gemelli. This marriage proved to be much less ill-omened than his first, and they had 6 children together. Though his medical practice and his wife's money provided a sufficient income, Nostradamus was an ambitious man and decided to turn his talent for divination into an income stream. Starting in 1551, he began to produce an annual almanac with astrological predictions for the coming year. In 1555, he published the first edition of his magnum, Opus Les Prophéties, the prophecies of Mr. Michael Nostradamus. It contains 350 quatrains or 4-line verses that reveal the secrets of the future. More editions followed. The last one, with 1,000 quatrains, appeared 2 years after his death. The quatrains are remarkably obscure, written in a confusing style and full of words borrowed from other languages. Some of them appear to predict events that happened centuries after Nostradamus' time. Some are so obscure that nobody has been able to figure out what they mean, and still others didn't pan out. The Great King of Terror, who was supposed to arrive in 1999, for example, was a no-show. Even so, the predictions of Nostradamus went on to become the most famous set of occult prophecies in the Western world.